Welcome back to Taiwan Talk on ICRT FM 100. I'm Ryan Drillsma, and this week I'm speaking to Scott Pursner, who's the Director of International Affairs for the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation. We talk about actions people can take to protect bird species, threats facing Taiwan's wild bird populations, and much more. Hello, Scott, and welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
So far, so good.
Now, when people think of animal conservation, they might think of zoos and places that take animals into captivity, treat them, and then release them into the wild. But obviously, wild birds are not in captivity. So how does wild bird conservation work?
Well, for our organization, just to give a little bit of background about me and my organization is the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation, or 中华民国夜鸟协会. And actually, for us, our purpose when we were founded in 1988 was education, bird watching, and conservation. Now, actually, we're an umbrella organization, so we have 21 partners throughout Taiwan and Taiwan's outlying islands. And each one of these partners has different goals and purposes for each one. So some are just clearly for bird watchers and things like that, and others actually have deeper conservation plans which they're involved in. So, in terms of what does conservation of birds entail, it's all kinds of things. So like you said, sometimes they are for doing rehabilitation or because populations are critically low. Other times it's doing things such as trying to adopt habitat in order to go ahead and protect the land that is critical for certain bird species, such as migratory species in areas like wetlands and things, because actually Taiwan's wetland numbers have decreased rapidly over the years, and there's only a fraction of the wetlands that were previously in Taiwan. And on top of that, most of them are actually not natural wetlands, but man-made wetlands or wetlands that were previously something else, such as salt pans or fish ponds, things like that.
Right, okay. So does the work you do with your partners just involve endangered or rare species of birds, or do you work on the conservation of birds that people might see every day around Taiwan?
Well, actually, that's an interesting question because, one of the things that Taiwan is amazing for is citizen science projects. And so Taiwan has some of the longest running and most robust citizen science projects for birds in Asia, in fact. And also Taiwan's open data is some of the best in Asia. And one of the citizen science projects that we do have here is called the Breeding Bird Survey, which is actually based off of the Breeding Bird Survey that was done in the United States. And this has been going on since 2009 because they wanted to go ahead and see what the situation for everyday birds was. And this is a project that, anybody who is interested can go ahead and get involved with. You do have to have a little bit of training, but this happens every March until July. And the theme of this is keeping common birds common. Because, it's interesting. If you look at globally the case of the yellow-breasted bunting, which you can find in China, and also you have some of them that will go to Taiwan's outlying Matsu Island and Japan, places like that. However, this bird species used to be hundreds of thousands, and now it's critically endangered. And so you could see within a couple generations, a bird species can actually disappear. So what they did in 2009 was they wanted to actually look at the situation facing these common birds. So they looked at about 160 different species. And now they've got a lot of data, and they are able to go ahead and track how the common birds, such as sparrows or doves or other bird species that you'd see commonly around Taiwan, are faring. And they actually even did a breeding bird index based off of the data for about over 90 species. And they've only done that over the course of the last few years in order to try and see if there were any major trends for the common birds in Taiwan.
That's interesting because a couple of generations is not a lot of time.
No, it's not.
Are there more species that are common now that may become less common in the future, do you think?
Well, it depends. However, Taiwan has quite a few really good conservation success stories. For instance, if you look at the case of the black-faced spoonbill, the black-faced spoonbill was, there were less than about 300 of them in the late 1980s. However, Taiwan was one of the countries that really spearheaded the conservation alongside other countries like Japan and then our friends in Hong Kong and other places in order to go ahead and conserve the black-faced spoonbill. And so actually citizen science study and population study of the black-faced spoonbill goes all the way back to the early 1990s in Taiwan. And actually, Taiwan did a great job, mostly from people power, and then later with the support of groups like the Council of Agriculture, in order to protect the critical habitat, the wintering habitat for black-faced spoonbill, because black-faced spoonbills are a migratory species, and so they spend the winter in Taiwan. And Taiwan, historically now has about 50 to 60% of the global wintering population. So I think that in the 2021 count, because Taiwan does a Taiwan black-faced spoonbill census in coordination with the global black-faced spoonbill census, which is done by our friends at the Hong Kong Birdwatching Society. And so Taiwan had over 3,000 for the first time, and the number of black-faced spoonbill internationally went to over 5,000 this year. So that's a really great conservation success. However, there are other globally threatened species, particularly migratory species, because if you can protect only the wintering habitat or the breeding habitat, you don't know what's happening along their stopover sites, and you don't know what's happening in their other areas. So in the case like this one species called the fairy pitta, in Chinese it's called basanyao. It's very pretty. It's called the eight-colored bird in Chinese, and one of their major summering areas is Taiwan, and so you've got a large number of them historically breeding in Yunlin as well as in Kaohsiung, and then there's even some recorded in New Taipei, and also even in Yilan. However, with the fairy pitta, their numbers have gone down dramatically. And I mean, in the past, they had said that there were problems in Taiwan with forest fragmentation, so habitat loss. However, one of the bigger concerns is that potentially there's something going on in their wintering habitat, which is the island of Borneo in Indonesia and Malaysia. However, more work is needed to be done, and so collaboration is more necessary in order to discuss what the reason is behind this reduction in the species numbers.
Okay, I actually wanted to ask you about your international collaboration work, because it was big news last year when the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation ended its partnership with BirdLife, which is an international conservation organization. How did this impact the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation?
Well, I mean, that was an extremely disappointing turn of events which took place. And I mean, we were removed from that partnership. And honestly, to this day, we're still not quite sure of the reasoning why we were removed from that partnership. Because as I said, we are completely people-powered NGO, non-governmental group that's been working on bird and wildlife conservation. Yeah, they had mentioned that our name was an issue, but for us, the thing that we always stick to is the conservation work, right? All that we can do and all that our partners have ever done is to try and work towards creating better conservation and working with our partners to do bird conservation, habitat restoration work, things like that. So essentially, domestically, our work has not changed whatsoever. Domestically, we are able to go ahead and continue working on all kinds of different projects and things throughout Taiwan and outlying islands. And on top of that, the data which we collect, all the things, all the studies, citizen science or otherwise, which organization is involved with, they get put onto things like the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is called GBIF, and then there's a local one called the Taiwan Biodiversity Information Facility. And so it's open data which can be shared with others. And all of our citizen science project data is also put on places like eBird, which is an online platform for viewing the observations of birds that people do individually and things like that. And so internationally, though, yeah, it's very disappointing that we lost this major platform where we could go ahead and share and learn things from others. However, we already had long-standing relationships with a number of other groups and things like that, and we still continue to maintain those relationships, and we're very happy to be able to do that. So we work with our friends such as, the Malaysia Nature Society, or we keep in good contact with the Wild Bird Society of Japan, and we work with the Hong Kong Birdwatching Society for the black-faced spoonbill census. And also one of our bigger collaboration works that we have here at CWBF is working with the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds on seabird bycatch mitigation, albatross and petrels essentially. Now, granted, this is something that many people might not necessarily think of when it comes to Taiwan, but Taiwan's fishing fleet is one of the largest in the world, and Taiwan catches around 1/4 of the world's tuna. And so a lot of Taiwan fishing vessels might be going into areas that overlap with foraging areas for albatross in the South Seas. So we've been working with that, with the RSPB for some time in order to try and promote mitigation measures to the Taiwan government and to fishing vessels. So that way, they are able to just catch fish and not birds.
Okay, interesting. So do you have any tips for when people encounter wild birds? Should they feed the birds?
This is a very tricky question because for many people they like to feed bread to the birds and things like that. And what's funny actually is one of the members of our executive board, when things started to get serious in terms of COVID here in Taiwan, they're a professor at NTU, and so they were riding the bicycle at NTU. And I think it's called like the Drunken Moon Lake. They got mobbed by a bunch of ducks and pigeons and other animals because there wasn't anybody feeding them. And so there was a conversation that was held on Facebook discussing, feeding the birds because, you do not want the birds to get too used to people feeding them because then they might not necessarily exhibit their normal behaviors that they would in the wild, right? And so that's something to be aware of. And so another thing is just, being mindful of how to go ahead and do bird watching and also going ahead and doing bird photography. I mean, we think that it's important that you should do things such as, ethical bird photography, such as, not chasing the birds, not catching the birds, trying not to go ahead and feed the birds in order to get them to come out for a photograph, just trying not to go ahead and disturb the birds in their area. I mean, I remember there was a big conversation, I think it was last year, because in Da'an Park, there was a species called, the Taiwan barbet. And so they nest inside of the hole of a tree. And I think somebody had tried to go ahead and put a camera inside the hole to try, be like National Geographic or something like that. And so it was an issue because, that's not proper and that's disturbing the birds as they're trying to do their breeding.
Right, so use a bit of common sense and try your best not to disturb their natural habitat.
Yeah, and their natural behaviors, yeah.
Right, I see. Okay, you mentioned earlier the platform eBird, where regular people can record their sightings of different birds around Taiwan. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Oh, sure. Actually, that's a fun story because, eBird eBird, the Taiwan portal, is managed by TWBF in collaboration with the Taiwan Endemic Species Research Institute. And it was started in about 2015, the Chinese language portal there for Taiwan. And prior to that, eBird came out in 2002, and it was done by the Audubon Society in collaboration with Cornell Lab for Ornithology. And so in Taiwan, prior to 2015, you had this website, which was on our old website, called the Taiwan Bird Database. And that had started in the early 1990s. And when TWBF was doing this, they were able to get the checklist of people who had been recording their bird sightings since the early 1970s. And so back in the day, in the mid-1990s, you had one computer in our office, and people would be bringing their checklist. And so you'd have one person keying in the data. It was, needless to say, a slow process back then. But, a lot of people are very active birders and are interested in going ahead and recording the things that they see. And so since 2015, Taiwan has been a shining star for eBird globally. So, everybody likes to say Taiwan number one, but actually Taiwan is number 7 in terms of checklists, which is for globally in terms of checklists, because there are over 530,000 submitted checklists from Taiwan and around 4,000 or so active eBirders. And so it's really, really great because, that information, anybody can go ahead and download the eBird app in order to go and key in, or just see what kind of birds that they've seen and observed. And now there's a really interesting thing on eBird called status and trends, which is essentially looking at, the data that people have collected and put in from their observations, which then they can go ahead and try and create, things such as migration or looking migratory patterns or ways that people or where the birds usually are located that help scientists to go ahead and do potentially conservation planning and things like that. And actually, a lot of people, they also say that, there's maybe trouble figuring out what bird they're looking at. Well, just last year, the TWBF was helping to go and promote another app called Merlin. Merlin is a bird identification app that recently, as of in 2019, 2020, they got a Taiwan pack. So basically, it can go ahead and help you look at birds that are in Taiwan. And it's a really interesting app because, it'll ask you questions, what's the size of the bird? What are the colors that you're seeing? And where is it located? Is it flying? Is it on a fence? And then you put in this data, and then it gives you some options for what bird you're potentially seeing. And it's actually quite helpful. And so this is something that we've been promoting because, TWBF will go and do classes teaching eBird to folks in different communities around Taiwan. And so one of the things that we've been also saying is that besides eBird, you could also pair it with Merlin, because Merlin has a function where once you've gone and identified it, if it is the bird, it can help you link to eBird in order to go ahead and add it into the site there.
Oh, okay. Interesting. My next question for you is, what are the biggest threats currently facing wild birds in Taiwan?
As with many other places, one of the bigger issues facing them might be habitat degradation. And climate change is something that is on the radar now. Two species such as, especially high elevation species, they're vertical migrants, which means that they go up and down mountains. So it's like in the summer, they'll go up the mountain, and then in the winter, they'll go down the mountain. However, it's been seen that, they are maybe going higher and higher because of climate change. And so they were listed as having threats to them and for this reason. So that's something that needs to be examined more, is the effect of climate change on bird species in Taiwan. And then also another area that's a very big topic is things such as, green energy with solar and wind power, because a lot of the solar power development is going on fish ponds as well as in nationalized salt pans, which are areas that a lot of migratory bird species and other bird species use, especially wintering migratory birds. And so these are areas that we are monitoring and working with our partners to go ahead and keep an eye on to see how these might be affecting them. So, for instance, back in I think September or October, there was a joint statement that we had produced in collaboration with a number of other NGOs and also scholars against the development of a solar panel farm in the Jiangjun salt pan, which is down in Tainan, because it's only about 200 hectares, but it saw 9 different globally threatened migratory waterbird species. And so eventually the plans for that area were stopped. However, due to the very rapid development of wind and solar energy in Taiwan, it's something that, constantly needs to be looked at.
That's interesting to hear because I actually interviewed a representative of a floating photovoltaic panel developer a few weeks ago.
Well, Budai wetlands that were there, they had done studies because, in Budai Section 8 and Section 9, they had put some solar panels in those areas. And so for certain bird species, they had an easier time adapting. So, for instance, egrets and herons, they were able to stand on it, and, they pooped on it a lot. So it's about every month that they would need to go ahead and clean off the solar panels. But it did affect species such as diving ducks, such as tufted ducks and species like that. And their numbers were reduced. However, more study is still needed because, again, this is all very, very new, right? In Taiwan, the development of these kinds of solar panel farms and wind farms have only been within the last few years.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Scott, for talking to me today.
Okay, thanks. Goodbye.
That was Scott Pursner of the Taiwan Wild Bird Federation on this week's episode of Taiwan Talk. Tune in next week on ICRT FM 100 for an all-new episode. Hi, I'm Ryan Drilsma.
And I'm Trevor Tortomasi.
And we're the co-hosts of Taiwan Talk.
You can catch our show on ICRT every Monday during the 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. newscasts.
Or you can catch us on Apple Podcasts, SoundOn, or wherever you might usually find podcasts.
New episodes are uploaded every Monday night.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with a new guest.